जो अपने भविष्य के लिए प्रोटेस्ट कर रहे थे, अपने फ्यूचर के लिए प्रोटेस्ट कर रहे थे, उनको कोई मजा नहीं आ रहा था। लाठियां खाई है 20 जुलाई को। अगर सरकार का उससे भी मन नहीं भरा है, अगर इतना सारा खून बहाकर भी सरकार का मन नहीं भरा है और वो बच्चों को ऐसे ही परेशान करती रही, तो हम फिर से सड़क पर उतरेंगे और जल्दी उतरेंगे।
पुलिस के द्वारा सबसे पहले तो मेरे पिताजी को शाम के 5 बजे थे, 3 या 4 दिन पहले उनको उठाया।
The resignation of the Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan following massive protests by the GenZ over the alleged irregularities with respect to the NEET paper over the paper leaks has made one thing very clear. If people are united, if people have a clear objective in their minds, if people apply sustained pressure on the system, then the government responds. It can be held accountable. But in the aftermath of the protests, after the people have been dispersed, the demands have been met, there are certain very important questions which are being raised. And that too from that aspect of constitution and democratic polity in which we live. Certain very, very important question. One important question is, should citizens continue to face the coercive action of the state? Should the citizens continue to face the coercive actions of the state through the police, even after the demands are met, even after the protest has subsided? Because there are certain serious allegations, there are certain serious reports where people are alleging that mass detentions are being carried out, mass arrests of youngsters is being carried out. Now this is a very serious issue. People are calling it the act of vengeance. It's an intimidation of the peaceful protesters. Because if these reports are true, if these reports with respect to the mass arrests of innocent youngsters are true, then this is not just about the debate over the NEET paper leak. It's not just about that issue. It's much about a broader aspect. It's about the relationship between the state and the citizens. The constitutional relationship between the citizen and the state. So what we'll be doing today is that we'll be looking this particular issue from various perspectives. So it becomes very, very important with respect to GS2 and GS4 ethics. But before we do that, let's look at the gravity of the issue. We have the Hindu which has covered this. We have the Cockroach Janata Party which has told to the government, stop witch hunt of the students or brace for new stir. We have some other reports. We have some other organizations. For example, the All India Students Association, which has said to the government that students involved in NEET paper leak agitation facing the police crackdown. Then we have the leader of opposition in Kerala, withdraw all cases against students. The leader of opposition in Kerala Assembly has said to the Kerala Chief Minister. Then we have some pleas which are being submitted in the Supreme Court. Pleas in Supreme Court allege illegal detentions in Bihar and Delhi. Then we have one of the MPs in Rajya Sabha MP A. Rahim moved the Supreme Court on Tuesday against the deployment of facial recognition technology and allied mass surveillance measures by the Delhi police against the students. So it's a very, very serious issue. Let's have a comprehensive analysis, right? Let's look from the very first perspective of democracy, the democratic perspective. Peaceful protests are integral to a democracy. If people are protesting peacefully, that is a good sign of a democracy. That is what we'll have to understand. It is a very strong indication of a strong democracy. We have part 3rd of the Indian Constitution talking about the fundamental rights, and we have Article 19, which talks about the freedom of speech and expression, freedom to peacefully assemble, freedom to form associations. So if people are exercising their fundamental rights within the reasonable restrictions peacefully, then they should not be suppressed. They should not be witch hunted. Dissent forms the very base of democracy. India has witnessed a lot of protests earlier. For example, the JP movement of 74. For example, the India against corruption, Nirbhaya protests, farmers protests. Each of these protests came up with some policy action by the government because it was a will of people which was reflected through these protests. And the government came up with changes in the public policy. So protests are integral to democracy. Peaceful protests are integral to democracy. They form the very heart and soul of a democratic polity. Dissent is not an exception to democracy. Dissent is the very integral part of a democracy. That's the very first perspective. Let's talk about the other perspective, and that is the rule of law. Very important concept given by the British jurist A.V. Dicey. We live in a state, a society, where there is the rule of law, not on the basis of the whims and fancies of the individuals. So rule of law matters the most. Absence of privileges, equality before law. We have Article 14 talking about that. And once we talk about the rule of law, it is the state's obligation, it's the state's constitutional obligation to make sure that rule of law is followed. Because please understand, even in this particular protest, we had certain anti-social elements who tried to take advantage of the situation. There were definitely people who damaged the public property, who assaulted the police, who incited violence. So those people must be held accountable. The law must take its course with respect to those people. Very, very important. But the legal response should be individual. It should not be collective. You cannot punish all just because some of the people were involved in the chaos and the confusion. The legal response must remain individualized rather than collective. Because the very task of policing is to enforce the laws. It's not about suppressing the dissent. There's a difference. The very task of policing is to enforce law, not to suppress the dissent. That is what would make sure that the constitutional governance is carried out. The principles of constitution are carried out. They're adhered to. Got it? Next is the national security perspective. The very obligation of the state is to make sure that national security is intact. Very, very important. And the history can tell us that in most of the protests which have been carried out around the world, certain fringe elements, certain people have tried to take the advantage of that particular situation. And those protests, peaceful protests, are vulnerable. They're vulnerable to radicalization. They're vulnerable to the external funding. So again, that can affect the stability of the state. So it is the very objective and the duty of the state to make sure that those potential threats that are dealt with according to the law. Again, according to the law. Security agencies cannot ignore these threats. But again, very important point is national security cannot become an all-purpose justification for excessive restrictions on civil liberties. You cannot use this aspect of national security for everything which happens. It should be used on a case-by-case basis. You cannot just take into that particular loop all the innocent protesters, because certain people had genuine concerns and they were protesting peacefully. So this is again very important aspect. National security is very important and those people must be dealt with, but not in a way that all people, the interest of all people is compromised. Next aspect is that of the ethical perspective. What ethical perspective says? It talks about the word proportionality. The response must be proportionate. Response cannot be disproportionate. Because right now the protests have subsided. People are dispersed. But what the allegations are, that the police is now going for mass detentions, mass arrests. And this is a kind of a prolonged punitive action. And this raises ethical concerns. Because if police is going for mass detentions of these innocent protesters I'm talking about, that too after the protests have subsided, after the demands are met, is it something which is giving a political message? And very important to differentiate. Is the state enforcing the law or sending the political message? Because understand, ethical governance is all about restraint. The legitimacy of a state, and please pay attention, the legitimacy of the state is not just about how the state uses its power. The legitimacy comes when the state knows when not to use it. The state should know when not to use power. That is how the legitimacy comes. Got it? So proportionate response is something which is very important. There has to be a due process. There has to be a framework within which the things should be carried out. Next perspective is the youth perspective, and very, very important. We have the GenZ, which has been the most important, the cornerstone of this particular protest. They have tried through various means to mobilize people so that their views, their voices can be heard. Because generally there was a particular notion that the Gen Z is politically apathetic. They're not sensitive. They're not politically, integrated. They're not aware with respect to what the politics is. But the events have shown otherwise. They showed that they are politically very active. They have raised their demands. They've showed that democratic engagement is very, very important. They have actively demonstrated it. But the cases of alleged witch hunting, if the Gen Z is subjected to these mass arrests and detention, even after the protest is subsided, then this would basically make sure that people distrust. It would increase the distrust of the people in the institutions which form the very bedrock of democracy. Got it? And this is also a strategic concern, because for a country like India, which talks about demographic dividend, which says that almost 2/3 of its population is young, if youths are being suppressed, if there are cases, if there are allegations that mass detentions are being carried out, then this is a strategic concern. They would lose the trust in the public institutions. The next perspective is institutional perspective. See, legitimacy with respect to the functioning of the state is very important. Legitimacy is very important. Institutions earn legitimacy when people have trust in them. Government earns legitimacy when basically government focuses on accountability, when it focuses on implementing an accountable framework. Police is seen as legitimate once it is impartial. Judiciary is seen as legitimate once it reviews the decisions independently. It has to be independent. Similarly, the education institutions would be legitimate once they focus on clear and transparent admission procedures. So legitimacy is very important in order to enhance the public trust. Because as I said in the last perspective, institutions form the very bedrock of democracy. Different institutions. You talk about, for example, Election Commission of India. You talk about, for example, the CAG, Comptroller and Auditor General. You talk about any institutions. Those form the very bedrock of democracy. And the trust of the people would only be maintained once these institutions would show that yes, they're adhering to the public interest. Got it? Next is international perspective. And very, very important. The real test is how government respond after the protests. It's not when the protests occur. It's about what the government does after the protests have been subsided. That's the real test of governance. And we have many international observers. We have seen there were people who protested outside the Indian embassy at many places, who supported the youth movement in the country. So India strives for becoming a Vishwaguru. And if we really want to achieve that, we'll have to make sure that the innocent people are not suppressed. The voices of the innocent people are not suppressed. Those people who have participated, who have allegedly participated in the incitement to violence, who have assaulted the policemen, who have damaged the public property, they should be dealt with, but not the innocent youngsters. So very, very important. What should be? In fact, there is one more perspective, that the aspect of constitutional morality, what Dr. Ambedkar described as the most important with respect to the functioning of the state. Adherence to the principles which form the very bedrock of the Constitution. That is constitutional morality. Liberty, equality, fraternity, justice. Got it? And there are two important values. One is that of liberty, the other is order. Those must be balanced. Liberty, that is the freedom of people to basically raise their voice. But it has to be balanced with order. Your voice should not incite violence. Order is an obligation of the state. The state must maintain that particular order, that balance. And this balance must be maintained with respect to liberty and order. That is how the constitutional morality would be achieved. The Constitution seeks a principled balance between liberty and order. Next, what should be the way forward? In this particular situation, the very first is that we need to distinguish the peaceful protesters from lawbreakers. There cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. There cannot be a common framework through which, a common lens through which you are looking at all the protesters. You must have a differentiated ground. Those people who really participated in this particular protest and who have damaged the property, who have hurt the other people, who have assaulted the policemen, they must be dealt with. Okay? Ensure the due process, judicial accountability. The procedural fairness must be maintained. Due process must be maintained. then independent review must take place. Independent review of those actions where there are alleged cases of harassment by the police, disproportionate use of power. There are cases, there are certain videos where police can be seen even harassing the women, touching their private parts, beating them with the lathis. That is unacceptable. So there has to be a judicial scrutiny and independent review of it. Institutional reforms are very important. For example, the very protest started with respect to the NEET controversy. We need to make sure that these institutions, for example, those who conduct the examination, they must be robust. And we need to go for systemic reforms, not just a reactive approach. We need to have a proactive approach. Then build channels for youth participation. The government this time tried to develop channels with respect to the youth, with respect to the Cockroach Janata Party. But this dialogue should be institutionalized so that there is a constant share of views between the government and different stakeholders, including the youths. Then we have the responsible political conduct. Very, very important. Every stakeholder, be it the political parties, be it the civil society, be it the opposition, they should have a proper conduct. They should follow a proper conduct, a proper political conduct. Only then we'll be able to achieve the very objectives of the democracy. Because understand, see, protests are a sign of a healthy democracy. And the state must listen to what people are saying, their genuine grievance. Otherwise, what is the use of a democratic polity? But those people who are deliberately hurting the system, who have committed assaults on people or the policemen, they must be dealt through the law. There has to be a proper process through which the things should be carried out. That is what you have to understand through this particular episode. Thank you. Jai Hind.